Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Here it is 2016, and for the first time in U.S. history, or so it seems, we have finally elected somebody who has not spent an entire career in politics. The question is, will this be the change we're hoping for like we did back in 2008 as we finally elected the first African American into the office? But after 8 years, most people don't feel anything has really changed. In fact, in some consensus, things have actually gotten worse. Since 1970, the government policies have contributed to the flow of wealth to the uppermost income strata, i.e. the 1% as it's called. The United States is more a plutocracy than a democracy, so it is known, and we're going to discover how this infrastructure of inequality, both open and hidden, obstructs the great majority of Americans from pursuing happiness, living healthy lives, and exercising basic rights. On the Beyond 50 radio program today, we're joined by the William T. Bryant Chair of American History, who has also taught at the University of Kentucky for more than 15 years. His newest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Ronald Formasato. Ronald, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, good morning, Daniel. Well, it's actually just afternoon here, and I must correct two things. I am emeritus, and not a correction, but please call me Ron.
Oh, well, Ron will work for me, too.
Great.
We don't try to be too politically correct on this show. We at least get it out there in the first place. But, you know, when you read a book like this, the first thing that really, to me it does, is it makes me angry to realize here is a body of people that are supposed to be there to protect its citizens. That's really its number one job. But it seems to be more exploiting the office for their own personal gains. I mean, we take a look at the Bush dynasty, for instance, you know, going back to Herbert Walker Bush, all the way back then. They seem to have been taking this office for their own gains, it seems like. And, you know, people look at this and they you know, kind of leave their head scratching going, what are we voting these people in office for in the first place?
It's a bipartisan affair, for sure. Inequality has grown under successive parties and presidents, although recent studies, and even not so recent studies, show that the economy does much better under, check the fact, this is not a partisan statement, under Democratic presidents than under Republican statements. There was just a recent article this week in the New York Times about a recent report showing that. It's a bipartisan affair. My next book, actually, and I don't really want to get into that too much, but because you brought it up, our people who are supposed to be protecting us are engaging in an extraordinary amount of self-dealing. And if you look at, to use a title that was used by two of my favorite political scientists, Norm Ornstein and Thomas Edsel. One's a conservative and one's a liberal, and they're friends since college, and they write some wonderful stuff. They wrote a book about Congress, and to coin a phrase, it's even worse than it looks. That's the title of their book about Congress, published a couple of years ago. In other words, the dysfunction is even worse than it looks.
No, it's interesting because you hear about Donald Trump talking about cleaning out the swamp, that maybe it's about time we finally hoist these people that basically have spent a career in politics making sure they get reelected, but really not doing much of anything else.
Well, that's the structure that is embedded in successive administrations. Obama came into office promising to not give lobbyists a central role in his administration. That went out the window pretty quickly. And it's almost, in my next book, there are several books published about this. Lee Drutman has a great book about lobbying. He's a political scientist. I could name a couple of others and it would bore your listeners, so let's not do that. But lobbyists are so embedded in the structure in Washington. Lobbyists move back and forth between think tanks. They move back and forth between administrations. They move back and forth between corporations and the executive branch of the government, and congressmen, 40% of congressmen now are running for office to become lobbyists afterward and make millions rather than just subsist on the poor old congressional salary. But of course they live like the 1% with their slush funds known as leadership PACs. And they want to continue that life, so they become lobbyists and they lead an even better life. It's embedded, just the way inequality is embedded in the tax structure, it's embedded in very obvious things, and it's embedded in some things are not so obvious. John Oliver had the great comment about the tax structure. He said, if you want to do something evil, make it boring. And so the tax structure is very boring to most Americans. They don't think about it. They do know, I hope, but it didn't seem to matter to the supporters that Donald Trump didn't pay any taxes for 18 years, but other issues were more important in the minds of his supporters.
Now, it's interesting, too, because you talk at length in the book about how they use the tax structures to their benefit. Let's kind of talk a little bit in detail of how that works.
Well, the carried interest loophole is it's a gift to Wall Street, financial people, financial firms, partnerships. Warren Buffett has said so many times he pays less taxes than his secretary does and most people in his office. I think some 30-plus people in his office. And then, of course, there are the tax havens offshore that we learned so much about with the publication of the Panama Papers. And by the way, the Panama Papers, with several 100,000 phony companies, scam companies that really are just tax havens created by this law firm in Panama City, right down the street from a Trump Tower, by the way. That's just a fraction of what's going on offshore. The estimated, Gabriel Zuckman just published a book. He's done great work with Thomas Piketty in terms of increasing inequality, and of course a bestseller of 2015 was the French economist Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. And Zuckman has worked with Piketty on a number of issues related to increasing inequality and inherited wealth. Zuckman estimates conservatively that close to $8 trillion is hidden offshore. There are other entities that estimate it to be much higher, in the range of 15 to 30. So much of it is hidden, and there are things that aren't measured, such as racehorses and yachts and estates and jewelry and mansions here and there. So it's again, there's increasing inequality globally. Oxfam reports on that. Inequality is still increasing in the United States. And the point to make is, when we talk about inequality, there's always been inequality. This is extreme inequality, and it's something that our founders never envisioned, and they'd be spinning in their graves if they knew about it, because they believed that this is a phrase from many, many letters of correspondence that people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and even Alexander Hamilton, who was very conservative, wrote to one another. The Republic can't survive unless we maintain a general condition of equality, a general condition of equality. Now, of course, they were talking about white men primarily, and they weren't even crazy about the very, very lower classes of white men, and they accepted slavery, although they were hoping, most of the founders were, that it would be put on the path to eventual elimination, which it wasn't, unfortunately. Things like the cotton gin and expansion into the West perpetuated slavery more than they expected. But what's happening in the United States today in terms of extreme inequality is so different from what the founders of this country wanted and expected and viewed as a very dangerous condition to be in.
Now, it's interesting to take a look at this because people would scratch their heads and think, okay, well, so what? What does this really mean? But when you describe what's happening, you really see how this inequality actually blocks opportunities for people of, let's say, the lower poor or middle class actually have the ability to chase that so-called American dream of building perhaps wealth and prosperity for themselves.
That's right. Hey, by the way, occupational hazard of professors, and I am retired as a professor now, but I'm still writing books, so I'm not retired from that. And I am well beyond 50, I must say. So, just so you know, I fit your profile.
Well, very good. Interestingly enough, you'd be surprised that we also have a tremendous listening audience between the ages of 25 and 35.
That's great. I hope they're listening today because they need to wake up. They need to wake up and realize the extent of inequality in this country and how it affects people's lives. There's just a recent study. Why does the inequality matter? Well, rich people live 9 years longer than poor people. How's that?
Right.
Rich people live nine more years than poor people. Well-off people, affluent people, there's a section on this in my book. 2 Florida counties. In one county, there's lots of disease, very few doctors per capita. There's obesity. There's lots of smoking. There's general unhealthiness, and the poverty level is very high. And that county votes one of the least voting counties in Florida. Right next to it is St. Johns County, very affluent county. There's St. Augustine beaches and golf courses and tennis courts. And people in that county, not only do they vote at an extraordinarily high rate, they don't wait to vote the way poor people in Miami waited in 2012, for example. We haven't had studies out yet about people waiting in 2016, but there were long lines in 2012 and in low-income areas in Cleveland and Miami and other cities because they don't have enough voting machines. What happened in this year's election, that's a different topic to get off on, but there was tremendous voter repression, contrary to what President-elect Trump has been saying. By the way, again, stop me if you want to get onto a different subject, but in your opening statement, you would be surprised to learn maybe that President Obama has surprisingly, I think, in the eyes of many people who think otherwise, probably did more to try to combat inequality than any president in the last 3-4 decades as it has risen. Income inequality has risen faster here than in almost every other developed country. Wealth inequality in this country is greater than in any developed country. That make the distinction between income inequality and wealth inequality. And what President Obama did with a number of policies, first of all, he talked about it. He talked about it. And he used his bully pulpit. And he, along with Pope Francis, I think, did a great deal to bring it to the attention of people. Bernie Sanders sure deserves lots of credit for bringing that to the attention of many Americans and pushing Hillary Clinton to say more about it. But Obama, in using executive orders to pay workers on federal contracts more than the current minimum wage, raising it to 10, to the glorious level in which you can no doubt live in unbridled luxury, $10 an hour, and in an executive order mandating paid sick leave for federal workers, and in a number of other areas, and especially with appointments to the National Labor Board that are working with the fast food workers striking for $15 an hour to allow them to negotiate, not quite as unions, but almost as unions, to allow them to negotiate against the idea that you can't negotiate because each individual franchise with McDonald's and with the big box stores, each of those is a unique entity. And in fact, the National Labor Board is accepting the principle that those are not unique entities because they all have the same standard operating procedures put out from central headquarters. And that has a potential to do a great deal to reduce inequality. Unfortunately, one of his more recent executive orders having to do with overtime pay. I'm not sure if you've seen the latest on that, but it's been challenged in, I think, 20 states dominated by Republican governors and legislatures. And this would be significant for people who are classified in their job in such a way that they cannot receive overtime pay, but that standard dates from 1976, and it doesn't take into account inflation and changes in the workplace. So there are several other measures I could mention, but he's been chipping away at inequality, and of course the sad fact is it's been increasing. It has been increasing. There's no doubt about that. So in that sense, your opening statement was absolutely correct.
So you get curious, is there a possibility or are there solutions for this to change, or are they just going to keep perpetuating this until there's no end in sight?
Well, my own view is highly pessimistic given the fact that we have now a government controlled by a billionaire who is appointing many other billionaires to office, and by a Republican Congress that has been interested in a long time in cutting benefits for poor people and in not raising the minimum wage and in weakening unions further, and in a whole range of things. For example, just reading in the newspaper this morning about this new bill on drugs. I'm sure every one of your listeners, no matter what age, knows of the recent scandals in the pharmaceutical industry with EpiPen and Martin Shkreli being the face of greed during the summer of 2015 briefly, but then we have the Valiant company whose operating policy was simply to buy old drugs and raise their prices and change their names, and because of patents and because of tricks of the trade that pharmaceutical companies use. And the fact of the matter is that most of the major pharmaceutical companies raise the prices of their drugs 10% every year. That's going to get a lot worse because the Democrats were talking about regulating more, and apparently this new bill, I just read this in the newspaper this morning, apparently this new bill, it's $1 billion, $6 billion plus spending bill, is removing regulations from the pharmaceutical companies that would have more of effect controlling prices. So I think we're going to see that's going to increase inequality for people on Medicare whose copay is going to go up, and it's going to happen. That's my sad prediction, but I hope I'm wrong. I hope the infrastructure proposals that President-elect Trump has been making and Republican congressional leaders as well as Democratic congressional leaders who've all been making noises about, okay, let's get some infrastructure spending going on, which Obama wanted to do, of course, but was prevented from doing by people like my Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell. I don't like saying that, the Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell. And I hope that at least they get going on that, and I hope they get some of those shovel-ready jobs that were promised way back in 2009. I hope we get lots of those and put people to work with decent incomes. I hope.
Now, you described something that I found also interesting as well as how the Supreme Court actually contributes to this inequality. Tell us how that works.
Well, the Supreme Court, and again, I think your younger readers are probably well aware of this. Supreme Court contributes to inequality by exacerbating political inequality. If money is speech, then those who got the gold have most of the speech. And that's what's been going on with both the Citizens United decision and then the McCutcheon decision that followed up. And the Supreme Court has allowed, and this may be changing, there's a test case brewing, but by never seeing a gerrymander that it didn't like, in which many people in a congressional district are essentially disfranchised, and the money, unlimited money pouring into those districts can have an enormous impact. And that's how the Supreme Court contributes to inequality. It also contributes to inequality, and I do discuss this, I think, in the book. It contributes to economic inequality by issuing judgments when a corporation is against a class action suit brought by people. The judgments are well over 50%, 70%, 80% favoring corporations. And that increases economic inequality if people really don't have their say in court. They can't get their say in court. And of course, many corporations have arbitration clauses, and the people who do the arbitrating are usually dependent on the corporations for their paycheck. So arbitrations, a huge percentage of the time, go against individuals in class action suits who are trying to get some measure of economic recompense and compensation, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So the Supreme Court across, oh, by the way, almost all the Supreme Court are millionaires, in some cases multimillionaires. Many of them are, I think, really out of touch with the way ordinary citizens live. And this is the first Supreme Court, and this was true when Antonin Scalia was alive. This was the first Supreme Court that we had in a long time in which no member came from politics. Why is that bad? Well, in the past, Supreme Court justices came from various walks of life other than being judges on a federal bench. And many of them had run for office. Many of them running for office were well acquainted with the role of money in politics. And if you've never run for office, then you're at some distance from the recognition. In the old phrase, money is the mother's milk of politics. The mother's milk of politics. Way back in the 19th century, the late 19th century, there was sort of the equivalent of Karl Rove and the Koch brothers all rolled into one. Mark Hanna, an industrialist who managed William McKinley's campaigns. And he was asked, what's the most important thing in politics? He said there's two things that are really important. Money, and right now I can't think of the other one.
Certainly enough. It's really interesting as you take a look at this last election. It almost seems like the great distraction was the media. People leave their heads scratching. Well, how come they were so slanted? The media is supposed to be this. And I said, well, if you've ever worked in the business, you realize your advertisers have a very powerful pull on the direction you go with what you actually spout out there about what you call the news. But you don't really see news too much anymore.
Oh, the media. Tell me about the media and its misplaced priorities. The 135 minutes, or 55 or 65, whatever it was, devoted to Hillary Clinton's emails on nightly news reports, and a third of that dealing with issues. And what about the presidential debates where not one question was asked about climate change? What about that? And climate change is something I did not discuss in my book, and I wish I had, at least briefly. Climate change affects the poorest people in this country and in the world far more than it does affluent people. The people most hurt by Hurricane Sandy were low-income people. There are Alaskan villages. Remember Obama's visit? And this is one way that he has called attention to both climate change and inequality. There are several Alaskan native villages threatened by rising tides, rising water, and storms. And some are seeking federal assistance to relocate. I just saw an article, I just glanced at it briefly. I think it was in the Times yesterday, about an Alaskan village that's going to make every effort to stay where they are, and they'll get some help for that, some state aid for that, but they're in a very perilous situation. Climate change affects, global warming affects the poor of the globe and the poor of this country. And things like pollution affect the poor. When the first Republican debate was held in Cleveland, Ohio, there was not one question from the moderators of the debate. I think there were 17 candidates at that point. That was, I think, the very, very first Republican debate. And there was not one question about climate change, and Cleveland has one of the dirtiest airs of any city in the United States, and there are record numbers of children who suffer from respiratory illnesses in Cleveland. And then their next debate, if you remember, was out in California. Didn't they feel the heat from the wildfires?
Apparently not.
Well, they didn't. I mean, it was extraordinary. Just down the road, up the road, I guess it was, up the road were these fires burning out of control, with California having suffered 4 years of extreme drought. It's been moderated somewhat since last I knew about that. But there they are with smoke billowing north of them. And didn't anybody notice that maybe there was a smell of smoke in the air? But they didn't. So there, again, that was an issue that was not addressed. Climate, Obama deserves credit. President Obama deserves, I think, some credit. There's things he didn't do that I wish he did very quickly. I would have liked to, along with other people, and this had an enormous impact on the 2016 campaign, and I also believe the outcome of the election. Because none of the financial perpetrators, some of whom committed felonies, and felonies that were committed both before 2008 and after 2008, none of them went to jail. None of them went to jail. I think that had an enormous impact on. But he deserves a great deal of credit for addressing climate change and connecting it to economic inequality. So I'm with him on that, and he deserves credit for that.
Well, here's an interesting thing that you bring up your book that people wouldn't think about, because they kind of look the other direction when it comes to things like this at times. But here's Obama. He's just one person against a Congress, and you talk about filibustering. Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, describe what that is, and certainly that landscape has changed from what it was originally set out to be.
The filibuster is quite a story. In fact, that book, let me just tell you a little story first about the filibuster. I mentioned Norm Ornstein's book earlier, It's Worse Than It Looks. That book begins with Senator Mitch McConnell filibustering a bill that he had introduced.
Really?
Yes. That book begins with Mitch McConnell filibustering a bill that he had introduced. You want to know why? Because Obama said he favored it. And we all know what McConnell said at the beginning of Obama's presidency, that he would do everything he could. Right after the inauguration, he met with a group of congressional leaders, important senators, and others, I think, in a Washington restaurant, right after Obama's administration, and said, we've got to do everything we can to make him a one-term president. We've got to obstruct him at every point And gradually people will become frustrated and we'll make him a one-term president. So what's a filibuster? First of all, and many Americans do not realize this, it is not in the Constitution. It's a Senate rule. Well, why is that so important? Because the Senate regards itself as the most hallowed legislative body on the planet. It may be, it's also one of the most undemocratic legislative bodies on the planet, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the filibuster is a Senate rule. And any senator can hold up a bill by invoking the filibuster rule so that something to pass needs 60 votes. And if you don't have that 60 votes, you're not going to get something passed important through the Senate. So that's what the filibuster is. It's a Senate rule. Now, Harry Reid changed it. Now, it's true that Democrats during the Bush presidency used the filibuster to obstruct some of Bush's judicial appointments. During the Obama presidency, the Senate Republicans, when they were in the minority, and then of course now that then they became in the majority, but when they were in the minority, they used the filibuster far more than the Democrats had during the Bush. And to me that's relatively important. Well, you did it first, and then you did it, and those kinds of arguments leave me cold. The point is that then Harry Reid, when he was the majority leader, modified the filibuster rule to say it would not apply to judicial appointments. Now, we're not talking about Supreme Court appointments, but lower-level federal judiciary appointments. And that's in a nutshell, that's what the filibuster is. But the filibuster gives an enormous amount of power to states with very small populations, so that senators who represent a very small portion of the population of the United States can block things from happening, and especially they block progressive change because many of them are very conservative, if not reactionary. When the Constitution gave here we go with the issue about how the Senate is an undemocratic legislative body. There is no legislative body in any parliamentary representative democracy that has the ratio of inequality that exists in the United States Senate. When the Constitution was established, the differences in population between the states were not that great. Now they are enormous. A vote in Wyoming is worth 66 times a vote in California, and it's now going to exceed more than 66 to 1. And let's get something clear. For a long time, the historical interpretation had it that there was a compromise between the big and small states, and that's how we got the 2 senators for each state, whereas the House of Representatives would be based on population. Well, it wasn't so much between the big states and the small states as it was the southern slave states insisting on greater representation, which they also got in the House of Representatives, with their slaves being counted as 3/5 of a person. Jefferson, who was elected in 1800, defeating the incumbent John Adams, who was continuing in many ways the Washington-Hamilton policy of the 1790s, the founding of the United States, which in many ways was highly constructive, and I think Hamilton is not quite the hero that he's been made out to be on Broadway, but that's another story. But Jefferson would not have been elected in 1800 without the electoral imbalance provided by the 3/5 representation giving to the slaves. That's a long answer to your question about the filibuster.
Now, what's interesting, though, about the filibuster is you were saying that they used to have to be there, but now it's become more of a virtual affair.
There are now virtual filibusters, and I said that there was a difference in the use of it by Democrats during the Bush administration. They have increased enormously as the use of the filibuster has increased enormously with the rise of political polarization, which is as severe as it's ever been. And that's something that many voters who voted for Trump, they'd like to see that change. Well, good luck. I hope it does change. But Obama came into office holding too long to the idea that the Republicans would work with him and that he could overcome the polarization of previous years. It didn't really happen. It didn't really happen. He got as much done as he could, especially during when he had a Democratic majority in Congress for a very brief time. But the polarization is so due to so many causes that have been written about by books that sometimes have nothing to do with politics and often do have lots to do with politics. The Pew Research Center publishes some wonderful research reports. They've been tracking polarization for years, and they see it climbing and climbing and climbing. And their last report was published not long before the election. And the title of the report was The Vanishing Center. The Vanishing Center. What do they mean by that? Well, the center is where things get done, where Republicans and Democrats, as they love to say, I can work across the aisle, they cross the aisle. They cross the aisle and they get things done. Like John McCain did with Russ Feingold when they got campaign finance reform passed. Struck down by Citizens United, and unfortunately the floodgates to money in elections have been opened. And what the Pew report says is that the polarization is so extreme that those who wish to work in the center really have no place to go. They're making a reference to an earlier work by the noted historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who worked in the Kennedy administration way back in the 1960s. And Schlesinger published a nifty little book that addressed how different parties work together, and he called it the Vital Center. The Vital Center. So in the 1960s, you have the Vital Center. In the 21st century, you have the Vanishing Center. And that's a sad state of affairs. In fact, there are various entities. The Economist, the British magazine, The Economist, a very conservative magazine, they publish some great research and some great investigative journalism as well. And they do a democracy index from time to time. And in terms of how healthy is democracy in the United States, it was very interesting when Donald Trump, as a candidate, was saying the election was rigged. Once he won, it wasn't so rigged. And don't dare challenge the results because millions, another false claim, millions voted legally. And everybody was saying, and I'm happy they were saying it, that we have a wonderful electoral system, except that it's so difficult to vote. And the difficulty of voting, the polarization, and a number of other factors, The Economist, in rating countries, developed democratic, putatively democratic countries, representative institutions, the United States ranks somewhere in the middle. The United States ranks somewhere in the middle. And voting in this country needs to be dramatically improved in terms of access to the vote. Don't close polling places, open them. Don't keep obsolete machinery in place, especially in low-income areas. Spend the money. Why can't money be spent on what all of those people were saying was the glory of American democracy, our elections, our virgin, pure elections? Well, they're not. They're not. They are cranky. They function on obsolete machinery, and too many states seeking to suppress voting of certain groups were reducing their voting places in this last election. It needs improvement. You know, Obama said, I don't know if you remember, in 2012, he gave a State of the Union address, I guess it was in 2013, in which he talked about some 80-something-year-old woman in Florida who he had in the visitors gallery. Do you remember that?
I believe I do, yes.
Yeah. And he said she waited in line for 2 hours or more to vote. He said, his classic words, we've got to fix that. We've gone in the opposite direction, unfortunately, and it's not been an accident. Many states have gone in the opposite direction deliberately. Some states have gone in a progressive direction to make voting easier, and that's all to the good, but there's still too much simple dysfunction in the way that we conduct our elections, and it needs to change. It needs to change. Now, will this new regime in Washington do something about that? I hope so. Maybe somebody can get, once he's president, Trump's ear, and the way the general got his ear about waterboarding, and maybe some good will come of that, and maybe he'll become a bully pulpit for that kind of improving the way we conduct our elections. But right now, they're not the best in the world, not by a long shot.
Well, I remember watching a brief interview with Jon Stewart, and many people remember him from the Jon Stewart show. And he was talking about, all of this, and he says, you really got to look at this country. First of all, we are a country of mixed races. And, the bottom line is America is just not easy. And I think the problem is that we've gotten to a point in many cases, especially I think with the young, not to point fingers because they're young, but you take a look at how they have reacted to this particular election here, and you realize the lack of depth their knowledge seems to be about what's really going on. That it's almost as though their information all came from social media. So basically they're out searching for the bias that supports what they believe in, whatever that may be, and that's enough. But in America, for things to happen, you've got to actually get involved with making things happen, which means an active role in our government if they're not doing what you would like them or that you think they should be doing, and get your butt in there and roll up your sleeves and go to work. I remember, thinking, it'd be kind of different to have Trump in office would be about the only reason I would have voted for him, or, the bottom line is because you really don't want Hillary in there continuing perhaps a whole new dynasty building, if you will, as I talked about earlier in the show. But the fact is that, when I would hear, let's say, and it seemed to be, a lot of the millennials, if you will, so anti-Trump and violently beating people in some cases for being Trump supporters, and I say to myself, so what do you believe it is about Trump that you can't stand, that you think he stands for? Well, he's a racist. And I said, well, do you realize America is a racist country? That's what more or less what it was founded on, and it's still happening today. That's really not going to go away because mixed races, you're just going to have that. It's a very unique country in the world, and it's hard. It's not an easy thing to deal with. Well, that he is a misogynist, so you believe in equality, that he's against women, that he hates women. Okay, so what would you like to do to see women's rights improve? What do you think should be done? And so basically what I'm doing is each time they would hit me with what they felt was something that Donald Trump shouldn't be. I said, but what are your solutions? What is your personal solution for making sure that doesn't happen, at least within the sphere of your influence? And most of them just kind of roll their eyes, shut down, and walk away. And I'm thinking, this is why we're having these problems. Because you're not taking an active role. You'd rather just bitch and run your mouth and get on Facebook and talk about what you don't like. And then you start inciting this so-called constitutional freedom of speech. Well, listen, I hate to alarm you. Maybe you fell asleep in class when they were teaching about the Constitution, but there's nothing in the Constitution that guarantees freedom of speech.
That's a great point.
Well, not only that, that's actually a term that was more or less coined during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Freedom of the press is in the Constitution, but not freedom of speech.
That's a wonderful point. And speaking of the young people and the effect of the election on them, I think bad acts went both ways, and there were reported incidents, and I think maybe they tend to be exaggerated, but I hope they are exaggerated, of even middle school kids feeling at liberty to insult some Muslim kid in the school. And I do know that there have been incidents on college campuses of Trump kids being harassed and vilified. And that's all wrong. And my kids, because they grew up not just in a liberal professor's and with a liberal mother's household, but I felt that because of, and I published lots of local op-eds, not so much during the summer because I'm away, but I had a quickie right after the election because it took me a couple of days. Why were my kids so upset? And I realized that maybe more than lots of other kids in different households, that they were, and friends of mine, they were brought up to think that hate speech is bad, that they should be accepting of people who are other, and that discrimination is wrong. And I think they experienced that all through their educational lives. And I know they ran into people who thought differently. My first time my son ever got in a fist fight was because he accused some kid of making bigoted remarks about Obama. He was in high school at the time. But kids on the other side aren't necessarily bigots or racists if they gloried in the election. And when you march, even the peaceful marchers, it doesn't matter. The march matters less than what this jibes with what you were saying. What matters is, what are you doing after the march? The march makes you feel good. But how about addressing some of the issues? You think women are, you think Trump talked badly about women? Well, what have you done in terms of recognizing that women are not paid the same amount for still that jobs that men do? I don't know if it's still 77 cents on the dollar. And also, what do you think of the Lilly Ledbetter Act? You ever hear of that? You know what that's all about? And that's still, let's hope the Republican Congress doesn't reverse that, because some Republicans in Congress don't like that. That has to do with discrimination in the workplace, and if a certain amount of time expires, you can't bring suit to recover lost wages. And I think it was the first bill that President Obama signed in 2009, was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, seeking wage equality for women, but they still get paid inequality. So what are you doing for that? And, there are also a lot of misplaced priorities. I want to get this in before our time ends. There are lots of misplaced priorities in terms of what do you really feel intensely about? And some of the stuff on college campuses about political correctness just boggles my mind. There's some law schools where you can't mention the word rape. What? In terms of talking about law? And then misplaced priorities. Right now, it's important. I've heard it over and over again, and I certainly agree. LGBT rights should be respected. But you know what? Income inequality is far more important than the bathroom you use. I gave an interview some months ago on a show, and I discovered at the last minute, about a day or two beforehand, that the host of the show was a very outspoken advocate for gays, and he had published a book about the necessity, as early as the 1990s, of gays coming out of the closet. And I realized that in my book, Plutocracy in America, along with not saying anything about climate change and how it affects inequality, I hadn't said anything about LGBT people. So I did a little research. And you know what? Lesbian couples, for example, in rural areas, are among the most poverty-stricken people in this country, and with children. And they suffer extreme discrimination. They lose jobs. Transgender kids are extremely discriminated against, and transgender people in the economic marketplace when they're looking for jobs. You know what? Which bathroom those people use is probably the last thing on their minds, next to having a decent income and having less food insecurity. 40-something% of households in this country suffer from food insecurity, the alleged richest country in the world. So those people are far more worried about, I think, food insecurity, a decent job, a decent income. Yeah, okay, the bathroom issue is important, but should it get the amount of attention it gets instead of the issue of economic inequality? That's my point.
Well, and it's a great point to make, because it's about asking the right questions and paying attention to the right things. I mean, after all, you know, if you've got inequality, then they can vote the bathrooms out altogether. You wouldn't have a bathroom to use in the first place. You know, and it's interesting that you see such distractions, too. You know, it's I think it was back in 2008, it could have been just before that, I really started paying attention to the media and how they report, especially when it came to elections. You know, people are saying, well, it's slanted today. You know, no, it may have been the worst thing you've seen this day and age during this year, but it started long before that. You know,
yes,
you just weren't paying
really
attention.
It really did. And let's not forget the role of the media in enabling and helping Trump during the primaries, especially when they gave him $2 billion worth of free advertising. $2 billion worth of free advertising. And Les Moonves, way back in 2015, he was then the CEO of CBS News. And he said, Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's very good for CBS. And what he liked, and this should be important to people who voted for Trump, as well as those who didn't. He said, what's really great is the candidates are not discussing issues, they're throwing bricks at one another, and that's what people want to see.
Sure they do.
Right.
Might as well have put Trump in a wrestling ring like he did back in the 80s.
Well, my point is that even Trump voters may hear that he got all that free advertising and say, oh, great, I'm happy they did that. And my point to them is just think about the fact of issues not being discussed, and maybe you ought to take a look in 2 years and see whether all those manufacturing jobs have come back, and whether the coal jobs have come back, and whether all those towns with the shuttered factories and the people suffering from opioid abuse and the middle-aged white guys committing suicide. Let's see if that's taken a big turnaround. I hope so.
Yeah, we can only hope, but the best thing you can do with hope is put it into action as well, like I talked about earlier. Now, I'm curious, Ron, is there a website people can discover more?
I'm sorry?
Is there a website that you have that people can discover more? Oh,
gosh, no. I'm on Facebook. I would just have them read my book, Plutocracy in America. It's pretty cheap if you get it over the internet. And my previous book was on the Tea Party, a very brief history, and despite my very progressive leanings, I think it was fairly balanced and was described as such by some unbiased evaluators. And but I'm technologically challenged. I'm very clumsy with. I write and I do research, and most of the time I screw up what I'm writing. So I'm not. I don't have a website. Maybe I should. I am on Facebook. I hesitate to say it because I don't like Facebook very much, especially with the promulgation of fake news. And when I got on it because an agent at the time who I was working with said, it's the age of self-promotion. You really need to do it. Promote yourself. And I did it. And then I discovered I was having lots of new friends who were doing the same thing, promoting themselves. So. Mm-hmm. But I like it because I communicate with my kids that way, especially my daughter in California, and aside from email and so forth. Anyway.
Well, Plutocracy in America is the book. Our guest today joining us, Ron Formisano. Ron, first of all, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program, and I will say to listeners, this is certainly a lot to digest when they do read this, but the most important thing to take away from it is that as you become aware of what the problems are, then it's your responsibility to seek the solutions, and that's certainly what America truly is about. It's about getting in there and getting in the fight. Again, it's not easy, but it's worth doing because you can't do this in any other country in the world, interestingly enough. And I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thank you.
You
bet. My next book, you can interview me.
All right. Sounds like a good time. Thanks again, Ron.
You bet.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. You can discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for a weekly e-newsletter so you can stay up to date on what's going on in the Beyond 50 community as well as upcoming programs. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Beyond 50 Radio as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.